Assalamu alaikum and a belated Eid Mubarak to all of you. We are living in a scenario when the macroeconomic scenarios are very challenging, and in the US economy on Wednesday আমরা দেখেছি যে latest inflation number came out as 9.1%, which is the largest 12-month increase since the period ending November 1981. সো 4 দশক আগে যখন ইনফ্লেশন রেট অনেক বেশি ছিল, তখন দ্য ফেডারেল রিজার্ভ, দ্য ইউএস সেন্ট্রাল ব্যাংক, পুশ দ্য ইকোনমি ইনটু আ রিসেশন টু স্টপ দ্য ইনফ্লেশন। অ্যান্ড যে মানুষটি এর পিছনে অগ্রণী ভূমিকা পালন করেন, তার নাম হচ্ছে তৎকালীন চেয়ারম্যান অফ দ্য ফেডারেল রিজার্ভ, পল ভলকার। সো রিসেন্টলি আমি একটি বই পড়ছিলাম অ্যাবাউট হিম, পল ভলকার, দ্য মেকিং অফ আ ফাইন্যান্সিয়াল লিজেন্ড। আমরা যদি বর্তমান প্রেক্ষাপট বুঝতে চাই, গ্লোবাল ইকোনমিক সিনারিও, দ্য রাইজিং ইনফ্লেশন, দ্য পলিসি রেসপন্সেস, so the 1970s and 1980s scenario has some resemblance with current economic scenario. Obviously each era is quite different in its own way. However, আমরা যদি একটু বুঝতে চাই যে কারেন্ট ইকোনমিক পলিসি মেকিং এবং what might happen if the central bank raise interest rate to fight the inflation. Alternatively, if they don't raise the interest rate, what are the challenges and what are the risk factors? So we can look back in the 1980s and how Paul Volcker boldly enacted some of the tight monetary policies to fight the inflation. So I strongly recommend reading this book to people who wanted to have an idea about what happened in those period and what can be the policy responses be. সো আমরা একটু দেখি যে 1981 সালে ইকোনমিক প্রেক্ষাপটটা কেমন ছিল। তখন আমরা দেখেছি যে দ্য ইউএস ইকোনমি ওয়াজ সাফারিং ফ্রম ডাবল ডিজিট ইনফ্লেশন, দ্য গ্যাস প্রাইসেস ওয়ার থ্রু দি রুফ, mortgage rates were sky high. As a result, the many middle class people could not afford to buy a home. The job market was very weak. The job market, the unemployment rate was 7%, and the nation was in full crisis. And the crisis was eventually ended by the bold policy making by Paul Volcker. So we will look into that in this video. Before that, আমরা একটু দেখতে চাই যে কেন 1970s আর 1980s এর দশকে ইনফ্লেশনটা একটা বড় চ্যালেঞ্জিং সিনারিও হয়েছিল এবং কেন ইনফ্লেশনটা হয়েছিল সেইটা আমরা একটু রিভিজিট করতে চাই। So before 1965, the inflation was stable for years. Inflation was hovering around 2 or below 2%. But around that time, the President Lyndon Johnson and his allies in the Congress, they began implementing increases in spending as part of the war against the poverty and the war against the escalating war in Vietnam. So some of the spending was funded by new taxes, but much of it wasn't. So as a result, there was higher deficits, and the increased spending was happened at a time the economy was at full employment. So this translated into higher prices. So the Johnson administration had no intention to restrain the spending. The Vietnam War and the anti-poverty agenda was his top priorities. So as a result, inflation gradually ticked higher and higher. And things got even worse under the President Richard Nixon. So the Vietnam War was still going on and it becoming expensive as ever. So because of that expensive war, US had to increase the money supply, and it was becoming very difficult to continue the gold standard era. So Richard Nixon decided to end the gold standard era. So let's look at what was the gold standard. So to stabilize the global exchange rates, the Bretton Woods system devised in 1944, where the Western nations agreed to peg their currency to the dollar, and which in turn could be converted to gold at a rate of fixed $35 per ounce. But because of the consistent increase in spending and inflation, the dollar was becoming overvalued relative to other currencies. So there were more dollars floating around the economy compared to the US that has the gold to back them. So in part, US inflation reducing the value of the dollar, and as a result, other currencies are getting stronger. So other countries were beginning to demand conversion of the dollar to gold at a level that US could not handle. So at that time, the US Treasury Under Secretary was the Paul Volcker. So with his suggestions and among other people who suggested to Nixon as well, so Richard Nixon decided to abandon the gold standard. And to reduce the inflation or control the inflation, he paired his announcement with wage and price controls. And because of that wage and price controls, it held back the inflation for a little while. But later on, he had to unwind those controls, and that would contribute to much worse inflation. On top of that, in 1973, things got even worse. The Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, the OPEC oil embargo on West, announced as punishment for US and other nations who supported the Israel in the Yom Kippur War. So the price of gas nearly quadrupled between October 1973 to January 1974. So this contributed to the first of the two extreme surges in inflation in that decade, and as a relatively long recession ending in 1975. So after that crisis, inflation settled to closer to 6 to 7% for a year for a bit. But inflation soon ramped up again, partially due to the surging energy and food prices. So let's look at what Paul Volcker did. Paul Volcker took office as Fed chairman on August 6, 1979. And before that, the Federal Reserve had tried small increases in interest rates in hopes of taming prices, but that effort was failed. So after joining, Paul Volcker called for a surprise meeting on October 6, 1979, and he set the Fed on a new, dramatically tighter course of monetary policy. So the Federal Reserve allowed the interest rate to go higher than before, and they announced it would recalibrate the policy regularly in response to changes in the money supply. So if the money supply was growing too quickly, the Fed would crack down the harder. And that month, Fed's interest rate was set at 13.7%. By April, it had spiked a full 4 percentage points to 17.6%. It went up to 20% at times in 1981. So higher interest rates generally reduce inflation by reducing spending, which in turn slows the economy and can lead to mass unemployment. When the Federal Reserve raises interest rates on everything from credit card debt to mortgage to business loans, everything goes up. So when it's more expensive to take out a business loan, businesses contract and they hire less. When mortgage rates are pricier, people buy fewer homes. When credit card rates are higher, people spend less. As a result, there was less spending and thus less inflation, but that contributed to slower economic growth as well. So Volcker's tightening slowed the economic activity enough by January 1980, and US was in recession. Later on, Federal Reserve reduced the interest rates, and that affected the fight that US economy was doing. But later on, they increased the interest rate again, and that caused the second recession by July 1981. This recession was far worse than the first one, while unemployment peaked at 7.8% during the 1980s recession, but by the time December 1982, the unemployment rate shot up to 10.8%. In the course of 1980s, this policy regime was known as the Volcker shock. So when Paul Volcker left office in August 1987, inflation was down to 3.4% from its peak of 9.8% in 1981. So after that, persistent low inflation has been the norm ever since. So US has never had inflation above 5% since 1983 until 2022. So Volcker was the most successful Fed chair in the history. He was a bold policymaker who beat back the inflation problem even when his action was greatly unpopular. He has done something that was politically unpopular as well, but economically necessary. So many people blamed Paul Volcker because it induced recession which was unnecessarily harsh. The Paul Volcker shock also affected the debt crisis in Latin America as well, because many Latin American governments had borrowed from US banks. And because of increase in interest rate in the US, the debt ballooned, and in 1982 the Mexico defaulted on its debts and some other countries followed. Currently, the Federal Reserve is raising interest rate. Many people are thinking the Federal Reserve is behind the curve. So if the inflation continues to be very high, the Fed might need to go for aggressive monetary tightening, aggressive increase in interest rate like what Paul Volcker did. So the central banks often face the dilemma when inflation is very, very high, whether they will cause the economy to go into recession to reduce the inflation, or whether they will escalate the problem to support the growth and employment. So their policy responses have huge impact on the economy and asset prices. So every analyst and asset owners and asset managers, they need to keep an eye on that, and they need to design and strategize the investment allocation as per the policy responses expected. That's all for today. Thanks for watching the video.